have an unidentified flying object.
I'm Mike Dukakis, and you're listening to Dr. J Radio Live.
I'm Jack Oswald, and you're listening.
This is Hudson Hamel, and you're listening to...
I'm Richard C. Hoagland, and you're listening to...
I'm Art Bell, and you're listening to Dr. J Radio Live.
We have an unidentified flying object.
Welcome back to another great episode of Dr. J Radio Live. Of course, I'm your host, Dr. J, broadcasting from the City of Angels, not only to America or the Americas, North and South America, but to around the globe. As always, we have a very special show for you today and a very important guest. If you've been hearing the show for the last 7 years or so, then you definitely know who this guest is. And let me just say one thing before I introduce him. Back in April of 2018, April 26, 2018, I was contacted to be a guest on a show that's competing with Coast to Coast AM called Beyond Reality Radio. And I didn't really know what they wanted to talk about, but nonetheless, I get on the show, and the very first thing that I overhear them talking about is different types of conspiracies, ufology, the ancient astronaut theory, JFK, ghosts, etc. And I said, there is one thing that one of my favorite guests, Robert Morningstar, told me something that changed my mind forever, because it seemed to me like he's the only one to put things all tied into one big thing. And these are the words I said. I said exactly what Robert said. There's no such thing as conspiracy theories, plural, mind you, conspiracy theories. No, there is just one conspiracy as a fact. One giant big lie that links everything into one. When Robert first said that to me several years ago, I cannot tell you how many hours, scores of hours I've had with Robert, and not one of the 2 minutes has been the same. So without further ado, let me bring on my guest, who's live in Manhattan, New York. Robert Morningstar, welcome back, my friend.
Thank you, John. It's great to hear you on the air again.
And let me just say for everybody out there, of course, I'm sure you heard him in the late night in the Midlands radio network family, but he is not just a guest. He is also a radio host, a radio reporter. He's an investigator, a journalist, a writer, and the editor and publisher for UFO Digest. And that's something you guys should all pay attention to, since, Robert, I should let you say it. What is the news about UFO Digest?
The news about UFO Digest is we're back online after 9 weeks of being hacked. And the reason we were hacked is that on June 3rd, I exposed, my co-writer, Roy Schaefer, and I exposed the real killers of Robert F. Kennedy. The real killer was the security guard, Thane Caesar. And we presented the proofs, and we were going for part two. Part two is called The Criminal Always Returns to the Scene of the Crime, and it involves photographs of the killer coming back to pick up his hat. And I'm very gratified. I ask you to go. I've left the article on. We came back a week ago, but I've left the article as the headline, and it's called The Last Acts of Robert F. Kennedy. Robert F. Kennedy fought for his life like a lion. He grabbed his killer by the throat. He ripped off his tie. He clutched the tie to his chest, and he wouldn't let go of it until he knew he was safe, and then he laid it out. And Time Life Incorporated covered it up just as they did covering up the murder of his brother, John F. Kennedy. So go to UFO Digest after the show, and I would appreciate your reading The Last Acts of Robert F.
And let me plug this in for all you folks. There is another guest whom I recorded, who you will all hear, who, because of his age, could not do live. He is 81, I believe, now. And it happens to be Dr. William Pepper. Dr. William Pepper was the attorney for Sirhan, as well as the attorney for the King family, I believe, to prove that James Earl Ray was the patsy. as was Sirhan Sirhan. And I'm glad I spoke to you before, Robert, because if it wasn't for you, I wouldn't have known names such as Thane Caesar, who had, or RFK had powder burns behind him. And one thing that Pepper did mention was that Sirhan Sirhan was facing RFK, and there was a distance between them. If he's facing him, bullets do not go whiz by you and then make a U-turn and come hit you behind the head and cause powder burns as if they're pressed against your skull. This would have had to come from, as you mentioned, Thane Caesar, who literally took his gun, put it against RFK's head from behind and shot it. And it wasn't also the fact that there were 8 bullets or eight bullets found or 8 shots fired when
I believe it was 13.
Yeah,
right.
Again,
Sirhan had fired 6.
Yeah,
and 13, at least 13 shots were fired, and they were in the walls, they were in the ceiling, they were in the people. One of the people who was shot, I believe his name's Paul Davis, he was an assistant to Robert Kennedy, was walking on ahead, and he turned around to see what was going on behind him, and he got shot in the head from the direction of Thane Caesar. So my friend Roy Schaefer believes that when Paul heard the shooting, he turned around, Thane Caesar looked at him and realized he was a witness, and so he shot him too. There's more to come. This is only the lifting of the veil right now.
Yes, and like you said, just barely the touching of lifting the veil, where it's just inches off the floor, let alone fully exposing what's there underneath the veil and on all 3 sides of it, or all 4 sides of it. If you have something 3-dimensional, then you have to obviously pay attention to what's also behind the veil or the so-called curtain. So I'm really excited to find out what's more to come out with regards to that, because I think when there's a lot of these tragedies, American tragedies, that the more that they're swept under the rug, there's this perception that they're just going to go away. But that has not been the case with JFK, with RFK, with MLK, and a lot of the famous people. I mean, even 9/11, we're coming up 17 years, and there are more questions to be asked than there are answers about what happened that day. There are more people questioning it now than people who saw it live and even lived in New York. Same thing with JFK. More people believe that JFK was assassinated by someone other than Oswald, or that it was more than one shooter, or that Oswald was a patsy. More people believe that there was a conspiracy than people believe that we have life on other planets. And that number is actually staggeringly high. I use the Zip Poll app to run a few questions about specifically whether life exists on other planets, whether life has been here, or even if in someone's mind microbial life could exist somewhere and we haven't found it. The consensus is 69% of the people said yes, life is evident all around the universe, and only 31% that said that there's nothing out there. Now, of those 69%, that I did a second poll that says, do you believe extraterrestrial intelligence has visited us, versus we haven't had visitation yet, under the assumption that there is life out there. And again, this was close to 2/3. And so if the JFK is higher than that, last time I remember hearing about a poll of how many Americans believe there was a conspiracy, it was, over 80%. 20% or less thought Oswald was the only shooter. And now we're going to, 55 years later? That's exactly what it's going to be at soon.
Yes, it's 55.
Yeah.
There's November.
On the 23rd, that's right. November 23rd, 1963 would have been the sad date. 5 years later, June 4th. Was it June 4th or June 6th? Was
June 6th. Always
6th.
remember this. Always remember this. Robert F. Kennedy was killed on 6/66.
Interesting, because I was thinking of just the month before, or is it 2 months before? Was it? It was May or April 4th. April 4th.
April
was when
4th,
Martin Luther King was killed.
1968.
Yeah. So you
I'll
have.
explain that in a moment. Dr. J, we have a bad connection, so I'm going to sign off, and I want you to call me right back.
Yeah,
so we have a better
absolutely.
connection, okay? I'm here.
Absolutely.
Please
Everyone,
call me right back.
hang tight. Mr. Morningstar, we were talking about Robert Mueller, and if he is worth 17.9 million. I mean, you could just search that yourself. And if he's going after Manafort, who is worth 60 million, do you really think people out there who have all these political connections, travel across the world, don't have offshore accounts? I'm sure if the tables were turned, Robert, against Mueller, the same way charges were brought against Manafort, I'm almost sure that you would find at least one Swiss account or a Cayman account or a United Arab Emirates account. Yet we don't hear that narrative. We're only hearing against what Manafort did. And for everybody out there, remember, Manafort worked on the campaign for 3 months. I think it was less than 3 months, not even 100 days. And I remember when he was facing all 18 charges, they were saying life in prison because 305 years is tantamount to life in prison. With these 8 charges being found guilty and the 10 were a mistrial, by having a mistrial, they could be retried. But I'm pretty sure that Mueller and the special counsel is satisfied with these 8 counts. Robert, do you think that 2 things. Do you think that Manafort is going to get a very severe sentence as Mueller is hoping? And secondly, do you think that President Trump will pardon him? Because I would think he would, but at the same time, I would think it would be bad, especially now where you have this divide in this country.
Well, I think that it was a kangaroo court. First of all, that's what I think, because all of these charges were reviewed back in 2005 and nothing was done then.
That's right.
So typically when gangsters get in charge of the justice system, they can, pardon the expression, trump up charges against anyone. As the saying goes, a prosecutor can indict a ham sandwich.
Yeah.
And in this case, I would like to point out to the folks that the real crime is treason, and the real treason that was conducted was the Uranium One deal. This is what the big cover-up is. All of this smoke and mirrors and theater using the kangaroo courts to keep the public distracted is to keep the American people distracted from the fact that Robert Mueller is a co-conspirator with Hillary Clinton, James Comey, James Clapper, John Brennan, and even Jeff Sessions, in all having approved the Uranium One deal, which sold 20% of America's uranium to Russia. That is the real Russian collusion. And knowing that all of their necks are in the noose, this rigmarole was hatched, along with Rosenstein, in order to protect themselves. The first thing was Comey wanted to keep his job as FBI director so he could keep the lid on it.
Yes.
President Trump said no. Then Comey asked to have Mueller reappointed after he'd spent 12 years as FBI director and was a real do-nothing and cover-up artist on the real 9/11 facts. They went hat in hand to the president, and they wanted to install Mueller. And the president said no. So, in an act of desperation, the very next day, the following day, Rod Rosenstein appointed Robert Mueller as a special counsel to investigate Russian collusion. Now here's the kicker. Here's the real deal. Robert Mueller is up to his neck in Uranium One. The Uranium One deal was hatched during the Obama administration's first year. It started with Robert Mueller delivering a sample of highly enriched uranium to Moscow to start the deal, to make the first contacts with Russia about uranium in September of 2009. And it was Robert Mueller who took the last sample in 2010 to seal the deal. When the deal was made, it had to be approved by a committee called CFUSA, Committee for Financial Investments in the USA. And this is a board which involved the president, the vice president, the head of national intelligence, James Clapper, the head of the CIA, John Brennan, the head of the FBI, James Comey, the Secretary of State, Hillary Clinton, and so on down the line, and including Jeff Sessions, who had to approve it as he was a member of 3 Senate committees that were also overseeing this deal. That is the real collusion. That is the real treason. Everything else is smoke and mirrors, distractions. Now, with regard to the conviction of Manafort, as I said, kangaroo court, you asked me about a pardon. I think the president will have to wait until after the elections, because it definitely would be very bad to, it would look bad for him to pardon him right away.
Yes.
So I think that's a very important thing to note. The second thing is Michael Cohen. Now, here's the deal with Michael Cohen. He's pleaded guilty to having paid off the stripper and porn star Stormy Daniels. And now the key is this. He paid off Stormy Daniels from his funds, and he was paid back by the president. The key to it all is this. If the president used his own money to pay Cohen, he's innocent. If he used money from the campaign to pay Cohen, then he's implicated. It's that simple.
Now, I don't think he'd be stupid enough to use campaign contributions to pay his private attorney, who's been in his attorney for so many years.
That is to be investigated, to be debated. But here's another thing, folks. A standing president cannot be indicted. People think, oh, that's not true. Absolutely true. And the reason is that if the founding fathers realized that a standing president could be intimidated, could be blackmailed, could be coerced with the threat of legal action, indictments against him. So they installed and instituted the process of impeachment. A president can be indicted, yes, but only after he's been impeached. So that's the key. Can they impeach the president? I don't think they can do it. I really don't believe it. As a matter of fact, I made a bet last night. I offered a bet last night to someone on the internet who was saying that the president was going to be impeached by the time of the elections. And I said that's wishful thinking and a fantasy that this guy was weaving. So I offered him a $100 bet payable on January 1st, 2019 via PayPal that the president will not be indicted during his first term, and very unlikely will be impeached or indicted during his first term. And the impossibility, if he gets the second term, he won't be impeached either.
First half of his term, actually. Because this is the midterm elections coming up.
Yes, we're not even there.
Yeah.
But now, you see the craziness of the swamp. They're going crazy because, folks, what the president is fighting is the deep state. Who the president is fighting are the people that killed President Kennedy, Martin Luther King, and Robert F. Kennedy. It was the CIA and the deep state that was involved in all of those murders.
And, of course, the Gulf of Tonkin and 9/11 and even Pearl Harbor.
All false flags.
All of them, because they needed support from everyday Americans for their cause. Because instead of trying to have or create money and jobs and grow the economy through a capitalist way, they're thinking of the old war way, which when I took my first economics course and the professor said, what's the best way for a country to grow its economy? Everyone had different ideas, but I didn't expect the answer that she said to come out of her mouth. And not only to come out of her mouth, but to be 100% true. She said, start a war. First of all, you're going to pay for all these soldiers. You're going to pay for the ammunition, the guns, the tanks, the aircraft, all the way down to their shoes, their shoelaces and toothpaste, Coca-Cola, everything. And then after you destroy that country, what do? You send American contractors there to build it up. So one war may cost so many billions or up to $1 trillion, but in the long term should hypothetically increase the economy of any given country. But what does that do for other aspects of the countries, the way it looks to other people or other countries? It looks like that the United States is a bully if this is the only way they know how to get money.
Yeah, but it's not the United States who's the bully. It's the deep state that's the bully. And they use the American people as pawns. And let me just say this. I have never seen a crazier political party than the Democrats, the Democratic Socialist Communists are today. And let me call it what it is. This is communism, the wolf in sheep's clothing. The wolf of communism is dressed in the sheep's clothing of the Democratic Party right now. They have assumed the strategies and the tactics of the Soviet Union. What we just saw is called a show trial.
Yes.
The trial of Manafort was called a show trial in the Soviet Union. It was to set an example and to keep the public in fear of the state, to show them the power of the state to demolish and destroy anyone's life. And I do believe that eventually the president will pardon Mr. Manafort, who had nothing to do with Russian collusion. The president had nothing to do with Russian collusion, and so they had to get a scapegoat, and that is what Mr. Manafort is. Mr. Manafort is suffering for all of us, folks, because they are using him as a tool to fight back against the only man who's had the courage to stand up against the people who killed President Kennedy, who killed Robert Kennedy, and a long train of others. They've also killed thousands and thousands of my generation. You mentioned the Gulf of Tonkin incident, where they faked torpedo boat attacks on a destroyer and used that as the excuse for beginning the bombing of Hanoi and North Vietnam. And there was no basis in fact. We know now that it was totally rigged. They intentionally misread sonar data in order to implicate North Vietnamese PT boats. And that is the last thing the North Vietnamese would have done. I mean, they weren't. Listen, the North Vietnamese are incredibly intelligent and fierce people. And here's the kicker. The domino theory. Everyone was afraid that if we pulled out of Vietnam,
the communist domino, that's
communist
right.
China would take it over.
Yes.
And that was the excuse for staying in as long as we did. Then we got out with the armistice during the Nixon administration. And then the war went on till 1975, when we finally pulled out in that terrible retreat from Saigon, when you saw the people hanging from the helicopter landing rails, you know? And then what happened? Did communist China take over Vietnam?
Nope.
Well, folks, communist China did try to take over Vietnam. They invaded Vietnam, and guess what happened? Vietnam kicked its ass. Vietnam has fought the Chinese for 1,000 years to preserve their national identity. And when the hordes of Chinese troops ventured into the jungles of Vietnam, they got an ass whooping they will never forget, and they were gone in a much shorter time. They were in a couple of months. They were gone back. And so the whole thing was false. The domino theory was fake. The Gulf of Tonkin attack was fake. And 58,000 of my generation, my classmates, died in Vietnam. And that's equal to, well, Gettysburg was pretty bad. And folks, they are trying to start a civil war in this country. We learned our lesson about civil wars in 1861 to 1865, you know? And we are not going to be so stupid as to do it again, but they are trying to inflame and instigate civil unrest and civil war. Let's not be stupid. We have a way of navigating through these things, but don't let yourself be pulled into hatred and violence. The other war we're fighting is corporate fascism. They try to label the administration as fascist, but the real fascism that is encroaching is coming from the corporations that are in league with Red China. Google is cooperating with Red China to censor the Chinese people, and now they started to do it to us.
Yeah, I was going to say,
Facebook,
I
YouTube.
just spoke to two people about YouTube, not just, of course, Alex Jones, but
Jerome
Tom
Corsi.
Schieffer, Jerome Corsi, even my YouTube channel. Things that used to be monetized, all of a sudden it has a gold symbol and it says not suitable for monetization. And one of them was Governor Jesse Ventura. It's like, what could he possibly say? A former governor who was also an actor, a Navy SEAL, and in the WWF. What could he possibly have said in a very G-rated show that would be inappropriate for audiences? And I just thought this was because there wasn't much activity, but confirmed today after talking to another great friend of mine, he's having the same issues. And I also heard it from somebody who, or a pair of people who I know who have a huge YouTube channel. So like you said, it is starting to happen here in the United States, the censorship.
And listen to this. I argue, this is my argument. You have a right to defend yourself. You have a right to the Second Amendment to bear arms. You have a constitutional right to freedom of speech, and you have a right to defend freedom of speech. And my analogy is this. If, for example, a law-abiding citizen is bearing arms legally in Texas, and some corporation or some individual came up and said, I'm going to take that gun away from you, and proceeded to try to take that right away from that citizen, all of us know that that citizen would have the right to defend himself against that seizure. Right? I say that we have exactly the same right to defend ourselves when somebody tries to strip us of freedom of speech. And if the government is forbidden by the Constitution of stripping us of freedom of speech, how much less so an individual citizen or a group of fanatic citizens like Antifa or a corporation, Google, YouTube, Facebook, any of them. We have to fight back. And there are many ways that we can do it. And I'm planning strategies. One of them is lawsuits. I don't think, listen, if 1,000 or 2,000 of us individually drew up lawsuits against Google, imagine how much money they'd lose, how much attention it would bring to the case. Folks, we are in a civil war, and they're trying to turn it into an uncivil civil war. Yes. Here's another thing. Freedom of the press and the right to freedom of the press ironically began in New York State with the case of Peter Zenger. The governor of New York at that time tried to stop Peter Zenger, or prosecute him or jail him for publishing news about the swamp of that time. And so he wanted to jail Peter Zenger, and it was in a trial in New York State that freedom of the press was decreed. And it's ironic that today, the governor of New York, Andrew Cuomo, is trying to do the same thing to television stations, newspapers, and others to forbid them from carrying an advertisement from one of his opponents, which exposes the swamp in New York State and the corruption of a certain Joe Percoco, who was convicted along with Sheldon Silver. People, these names you don't know. People in New York know them. They were entrenched in power, and they were, receiving bribes hand over fist. And so now Governor Cuomo and his mouthpiece, son in CNN, Chris Cuomo, are assailing and attacking the president, the Republican ideology, on an everyday basis. And so yesterday, a couple of days ago, when I heard Chris Cuomo, debating Eric Prince about, I quipped this on my Facebook. Has anybody other than me noticed that more in the word communist? And maybe we should start spelling the word Cuomo. So Governor Andrew Cuomonist is trying to stifle freedom of the press with his mouthpiece son assailing and attacking the president on an everyday basis. And if we want to talk about Afghanistan, I'd like to say a few things about that a little bit later, but let me turn it over to you, Dr. Jane.
I was going to say I'm glad you brought that up with turning Cuomo into communist, because one of the names, aside from CNN being called Clinton News Network, is Communist News Network. So I think that would be very fitting, very, very fitting. Let me ask you about Antifa.
Cuomo-unist. It's pronounced Cuomo-unist.
Let me ask you, talk about Antifa real quick. This group popped up out of nowhere. They look very menacing with their all black clothing and their chants, and of course wearing these black bandanas and everything else, like steel toe boots. And comparing their flag and just Googling them, it turns out that they modeled their flag after the Antifa movement that existed in Nazi Germany in the 30s. Now, I mean, why would that exist 80 years later? I mean, what sparked that revolution, or who's funding them? I mean, that's a very big
funding. We do know who's funding it, George Soros. And it brings us to the point of their manual, the Rules for Radical. Rules for Radicals by Saul Alinsky, who was a mentor of Hillary Clinton, an arch-communist from Chicago, who drew up a book which he called Rules for Radicals. And basically what that book is a strategy for seeding chaos, dissension, antagonism. And it's not ironic, it is a fact, that Alinsky dedicated that book to Lucifer, whom he called the first rebel. And when you read the preface, that's exactly what he says. This book is dedicated to Lucifer. And so we have a Luciferian ideology that's running rampant throughout the United States. And it has infiltrated almost every element of formerly Democratic Party. The president calls it Democrat Party.
Yeah.
And now they're self-styled democratic socialists. What's the difference between a socialist and a communist?
Very little, from what I know.
The saying is this: a communist is a socialist in a hurry.
Yeah. And you know what? Let me ask you about George Soros, because this is something that no one can answer. If he has so much money, so many billions of dollars, why is he funding the Democrat Socialist Party of America, or anybody that has to do with the left? Usually people with money would want less government, less regulations, less taxes, but yet when you go to the other side, to the so-called Democrat side, which some people have even stated is no longer democratic, it's just the Democrat. They made a very big distinction between democracy and the Democrat Party, especially now that it's going even further left into the Democrat Socialist Party of America. But why, in your opinion, do you think someone with George Soros's money, wealth, and influence would do everything that you would think would be opposite if someone was in the same position as him?
Well, I think people have a misconception that there are no billionaires in communist countries. But the fact is, in capitalism in America today, we have hundreds of billionaires. But in the Soviet Union, it was a handful of billionaires because communism provides the tyrant with the ability to seize all of the assets, all of the funds, all of the taxes of a nation and utilize them in a monolithic way. So George Soros is a power-hungry demagogue. He cooperated with the Nazis, turning in his own people. George Soros was Jewish, is Jewish. And during World War II, he volunteered as a Nazi snitch. He would go around in a Nazi uniform and point out to the Nazis in Hungary who were the Jews and where were they hiding. And when he was asked about it, did he have any regrets? And he said, no, it was the happiest time of my life. Now, George Soros and his ilk, Hillary Clinton, Bill Ayers, Bill Gates, they're all in league with the New World Order. That was their idea. And the New World Order is a plan that was hatched a very, very long time ago, far longer ago than when George H.W. Bush, talked about the New World Order in his speech and those 1,000 points of light, which are so ironic. I'm going to tell you what the 1,000 points of light were. That goes back, way, way back to, I would say seriously, post-World War II, when they hatched the idea of the United Nations. And the plan was to bring the United States into the United Nations and slowly amalgamate all the countries into one system with no national identity, no national borders. And this is the thing that people don't understand. Listen to this. The word racism, which is bandied about every day in the media and hurled at people, that word was first used politically and coined, in a sense, as an attack, a weapon of attack, by Leon Trotsky. And the original meaning of racism, according to Trotsky, was anyone who loved his nation, his ethnicity, his culture, and his own identity more than they loved communism. That's what a racist was. And they have used that word as a cudgel against everyone who loves his country, is proud of his ethnicity and his national identity. And that is what they're doing in this country today. So beware of that label, but don't be afraid of it. Beware of the label, but don't be afraid to be called a racist when you know you're not. If you love your country, if you love your culture, if you love your African American culture, if you love your Hispanic culture, if you love your Muslim culture, that's identity. They are against all of it because national identity was an impediment to Soviet Union. Let me say something else about the Democratic Party as it used to be. I was a Democrat from the time I first saw John F. Kennedy in 1958. Talk about love at first sight. I had never seen or heard anyone like John F. Kennedy. And it was in 1958 that I saw something called Meet the Press. And there were these 5 potential candidates for president then. And there was this one man sitting in his chair, and he was so straight, so upright, so charismatic. I said, who the heck is that? And the moment he opened his mouth, I just couldn't stop listening. So when he ran for president, I was a pamphleteer. I was a pamphlet boy. There was no internet in those days. There was no Facebook. And all of the advertising, the majority of the advertising occurred with local Democratic and Republican headquarters and neighborhoods. And they would recruit everyone who was for them to go around and pamphleteer. I would take stacks of hundreds of pamphlets and walk every floor of high-rises in my neighborhood, go to every door, put the pamphlet in, and John Kennedy appeared to speak on Halloween. Just before the election in 1960, John F. Kennedy appeared one block from my corner. In 1964, 65, when Robert Kennedy was running for senator, he was here on my corner twice. In 1967, when Robert Kennedy was senator, I was coming home from a basketball game and crossing Park Avenue with some friends of mine from Power Memorial Academy. We were the nation's #1 basketball team at that time. And I have the privilege of having gone to school with Kareem Jabbar. And I tell the anecdote of how I ran into his belt buckle many times. So this limousine pulls up, black caddy, goes right in front of me. The door whips open. I step back from the swing of the door, and out steps Robert Kennedy. And we look at each other in the eyes, and this was my reaction. Oh, my God. We both have hazel eyes. We both have hook noses. We both have hook eyes, hook noses. We have hook noses, hawk eyes, and brown hair, brown curly hair. And I said, my God, we look like cousins. He did a double take like he was thinking the same thing, and just a broad smile. He greeted us all, and then he went on. And a year later, he was assassinated in Los Angeles. And I said 666. June 6th of 1968 numerologically reduces to 666. That was the devil's work. This was a satanic religious sacrifice. The sacrifice of the Kennedys, the sacrifice of Martin Luther King. They all occurred on really significant numerological and astrological days. What people don't know about April 4th is that traditionally, April 4th, the year 30, is supposedly the day that Jesus Christ was crucified. That was an esoteric tradition. And so all of these heinous acts were dressed up in religious robery in order to sanctify them as sacrifices to Lucifer. Who killed John F. Kennedy? Who killed the Kennedys? Who killed Martin Luther King? Lucifer killed Martin Luther King. Lucifer killed John F. Kennedy. And now he is rampant, running rampant through the country, trying to turn us all against each other. Beware those who seed hate in your heart. Beware those who speak to raise anger in your heart. Beware those who try to turn you against your fellow man, your fellow citizen.
Those people, I believe, are running on a lower frequency than those who are more aware and realize that we are all related. We are all brothers and sisters. We all spill the same blood. I mean, so when people try to divide or throw hate in the cause, it really doesn't get anywhere. Has anyone ever seen something that started with hate turn into a fight, whether it be physical or any sort of fight, end up in a positive light? Of course not. So just like you said, beware of those who have hate. Now let me ask you about esoteric dates. You also mentioned April 4th, 1968. That was the day that you said that Jesus was it crucified or resurrected? Resurrected.
No, the crucifixion supposedly happened on April 4th, 30 AD.
That was the crucifixion.
That was a long-held tradition.
Now, that was the same day, as we said earlier, that Martin Luther King Jr. was killed. Right. And one of the things you had me ask, Dr. William Pepper, was, two things you had me ask. Who changed the suite, the assassin's suite? And he did mention one room was 202 and then eventually ended up being 306. And the other thing you told me to ask him was whose footprint was size 14. And he talked about a footprint that was between 13 and 14 in the bushes. He also gave me a name. Do you recall who that name of that other shooter was who actually did kill Martin Luther King?
Yes. His name was Frank Strausser.
That was the doctor that suffocated him.
No. Frank Strausser was the shooter. Dr. Bland Breen was the man who suffocated.
That's what it was.
Okay, let's clear that up for the folks. First, James Earl Ray did not shoot Martin Luther King. He was just as big a patsy, set up just like Lee Oswald was set up. The man who shot Dr. Martin Luther King, shot him but did not kill him, was Frank Strouser, a member of the Memphis Police Department who was also a member of the CIA. Dr. King was still alive. And before the assassination occurred, and this is in the book by Dr. William Pepper, before Martin Luther King was assassinated, to be assassinated, a certain Ku Klux Klan doctor and also associate of the Dixie Mafia said to the killers, if he survives, make sure that you bring him to St. Joseph's Hospital.
That's right.
And that's exactly what they did. And he was rushed to St. Joseph's Hospital into the emergency room where their trauma team was trying to save him. And in walked Dr. Bland Breen, accompanied by two men in black suits, and ordered everyone out of the room. Everyone. The doctors who were attending him, the nurses who were there. They left, but one nurse, curious as to what was happening, hung back, snuck back, and peeked between the curtains. And she saw Dr. Bland Breen and these two men in black take a pillow and suffocate Dr. Martin Luther King and then further desecrate his body.
I know.
And this all came out in a civil trial that Dr. William Pepper was successful in bringing about to try James Earl Ray in Memphis, and he was exonerated. The jury found him not guilty. But of course, it had no binding power, and he spent the rest of his time, the rest of his life, in jail. I'm very proud to have helped Dr. William Pepper in 1997 when he was working to get that trial. I found a document, or I had a document actually for several years. It's called the Miltier File. The Miltier File is a transcript of secret recordings that were made by the Miami Police Department in November 8th, actually, of 1963, 2 weeks before the President Kennedy was killed. They were recording a poker game between a Miami police informant named William Somerset and the third leading man in the Ku Klux Klan, whose name was Joseph Miltier. And in that conversation, they discussed the assassination plot against President Kennedy, and they described two of them. They described one where he would be shot by someone with a telescopic rifle from a high office building, and that the rifle would be a knockdown rifle, easily disassembled, and that a patsy would be picked up a couple of hours and the killing pinned on him. And he also mentioned that a certain Ku Klux Klansman named Jack Lee Brown was stalking President Kennedy and Martin Luther King, and that one of the plans to kill President Kennedy, aside from the high office building, was to set up a shooter in a hotel across from the White House or some other venue where the president would be expected to come out on a veranda, on a porch, and to shoot him on the porch. When I read that, I said, Dr. Pepper has to see this, because this plan, this Ku Klux Klan plan that was used to kill Martin Luther King was described 5 years earlier in the Miltier Files. So it just happened that a dear friend of mine from England was here, and she was going back to London, and I got the file, I printed it out, I contacted Dr. Pepper, got his address in Finsbury Court, where he was at his offices then, and it was personally hand-delivered to him. And that document became part of the evidence that led to the civil trial of James Earl Ray. And I actually had the pleasure of calling Bushy Mountain Prison, where he was being held, and speaking to a guard. I was trying to talk to James Earl Ray, but she said, no, you can't talk to him. So I gave her the message, and she promised that she would carry it to him. And then one day, I believe it was in 1999, one morning, I got up, as was my habit then, on Sundays, to brew my cup of coffee, sit down, and watch the news. When I turned it on, there, I couldn't believe my eyes. There before me sat James Earl Ray, Dr. William Pepper, and Dexter King, the eldest son of Dr. Martin Luther King. And Dexter King turned to James Earl Ray and he said, "Mr. Ray, did you kill my father?" And James Earl Ray said, "No, sir, I did not kill your father." And it was one of the happiest moments of my life.
Now, this
Because
was also the time that Pepper was able to receive a judgment for wrongful death for Martin Luther King. Although the award was not big, it was only $100. It was for the recognition, as I
Yes,
stated.
of course.
That's what you were working on them with from '97 to '99.
It's symbolic justice, but symbolic justice is very gratifying as well. So
It is. It is. And he needs to be kept in the limelight because he's done so much. You know, if his life wasn't cut down so short and so quick, I believe we'd be in a far different country, more peace. I don't think we would have had nearly as many wars. And there was a chance you could have seen him in the White House. Now, this is going to be a quick change because I just mentioned the word White House. But before we move off the topics of the three major assassinations of the 60s of JFK, RFK, and MLK, all ending in K, another thing
Right.
you also mentioned,
yes,
is the fact that every single day in the Oval Office, there is a prayer for justice for JFK.
yes, I was very gratified to hear that because my first ebook, one of the first electronic books, which was technically just a text file on the internet in 1993 and 94, when I exposed the doctoring of the Zapruder film and the use of Officer Tippett's body as a substitute for the president in the Warren Commission autopsy. I named that book Justice for JFK. And that's what I work for every day. Justice for JFK, his brother Robert, for Dr. Martin Luther King, for John Lennon. John Lennon was another assassination with geopolitical overtones. John Lennon was rising as an anti-war, not candidate, but an anti-war figure,
Activist.
spokesman for peace. And he was standing in the way of the New World Order. And so he had to be silenced. And so they silenced him. And it's very interesting, Chapman, go and take a look at pictures of Chapman and compare them to pictures of Hinckley. When Hinckley shot President Reagan, or one of the shots at President Reagan, I saw his picture and I said, my God, this guy looks like a clone of Mark David Chapman. What are they, collecting these guys? Cloning them? Manufacturing them? And then you find out that Chapman and Hinckley both have very interesting, call it career paths, that brought them in close proximity to hospitals and bases where MK Ultra type of mind control operations were being conducted. So I consider them both Manchurian candidate mind controlled idiots. And the fact is that John Hinckley's parents had dinner with the George Bush family 2 weeks before the attempted assassination on President Reagan. And Neil Bush was supposed to have dinner with the Hinkleys that very night. So it's a very incestuous affair, all of these things that we're discussing here. And that's why I say there is no conspiracy theory. There's one all overarching conspiracy, and all of the others are subsets of that conspiracy. But that conspiracy has been broken by the election of President Donald Trump. The New World Order is not going to happen because Donald Trump was elected president. And there is a resurgence in America and a return to our roots. That's what we're fighting for now. That's why I say to everyone, you have immense power right in your hands. That computer in front of you has invested you with a tremendous amount of power, and you must use it. Use it for the good. Use it to protect your constitutional rights.
You know, there was this great video that was allegedly created by Q or someone impersonating Q, if Q even exists, because depending on who you ask, it's either a conspiracy, a really great conspiracy, or it's somebody really close to President number 45, Donald J. Trump. The video is called "The Plan to Save the World." And it talks about how you have the evils of the government, including the corporations, and everybody you listed, from Comey to Mueller to the Clintons and even to Obama and all the other people that fall in between, including the intelligence agencies. And they said how the NSA has been, with the advance of technology, they've had the ability to record us, track us, and listen to us, everything that we're doing, because of all these devices. But it says it started to take a turn because a lot of these people who were in those high powers that were doing the watching were also recklessly using these same devices. So if somehow somebody from the NSA can come forward, I mean, not somebody who is a private contractor like Snowden, but let's say like a mass exodus, or maybe a former director or directors, plural, could come out and to use the same tools that they're using to spy on everyday people, not just Americans, because they're spying globally, and flip the script and investigate the people who have been doing the investigating. You're going to find a lot of dirt.
So that's exactly what has happened. I was just discussing today, I put up an old article on Facebook regarding the laptop that's in the possession of the New York City Police Department that was seized in Anthony Weiner's arrest. And
Yes.
They have found so much crime on that laptop, and they were going to move on it. They were going to begin indictments of the Clintons based on the so-called insurance policy, a file called insurance, and that was Huma Abedin's file.
Yeah, and let me make this public for everyone in case they don't know, and which I'm sure everyone knows. Huma Abedin is Weiner's wife, but she's also Hillary Clinton's lover and has been her go-to person for 18 years or so, Robert, something like that.
Oh yes, and intimately associated with the Muslim Brotherhood.
Yes.
What we had in the Obama administration was an infiltration of the U.S. government by Muslim communists. And you may think it's strange to hear those two words together, but let me say this. I recognize things before they're named, and sometimes I have to create the name in order to identify it. And in the 1990s, I was following the course of Islam and its work, its collusion with communists all around the world. So I coined the word communism. You've heard the word Islamofascist. That was coined in Europe. But long before that word was used, in 1998 and 99, when I found out that China was funding Muslim terrorist cells all around the world, I came up with the word communism. And many of my friends said, oh my God, that's really, Robert, that's really fanatic, that's inflammatory. I said, but it's the truth. And I kept using it. And then lo and behold, after 9/11, I got intimately involved with the capture of the 9/11 terrorists and tracking down Osama bin Laden. I helped the FBI capture the leader of the Hamburg cell because I bumped into those fellows in 1998 in Hamburg. And then in 2002, Osama bin Laden had fled into Afghanistan and was living in a cave, and he issued a fatwa. And it came out in BBC News. And when I read it, I memorized it because it was the validation and the vindication of my term. What Osama bin Laden said in July of 2002 was a fatwa, an order, and it said this, translated into English. I urge all members of the Ummah to support communist insurrections wherever they may occur, because communism and Islam are the same thing. And there it was, from the horse's mouth.
And this was 2002, you said.
2002.
Yeah,
In
right
July of
before we actually
2002.
went to Iraq, when we still had, I believe it was that football player, Tillman, that was killed in Afghanistan when we had the first soldiers going there after 9/11, before
Right.
the war was spread.
Right.
Here's an interesting topic that I talked to you off air. I think it's something we might as well talk on air if you're comfortable. You mentioned it briefly of the Hamburg cell, but there's
Yes.
one person in particular, a famous passport that survived.
Oh, yes, Mohammed Atta.
Yes, can we talk
Mohammed
about
Atta is the most
him?
evil man I've ever met. And I
Yes,
met him twice.
yes. Let's
I
hear
met him
about
in
that.
Hamburg, where he was invited to a table where I was seated with many wonderful friends. I have a large circle of friends in Europe. It's centered in Hamburg, and we called our group the Ungebroken Kette, the unbroken chain. And there was a group of Germans, Dutch, and Americans who were in Hamburg, and we were having a wonderful little get together in a place called Borker's Bar in Eppendorf. And it was, you know, a beer hall, dimly lit table lamps, and a large round table with about, 7 of us seated there. And then a German who was there, who had been invited to meet me, looked up and he signaled to somebody to come over. And that's when this picnic changed. This party changed. You know, like a picnic when the crows come in and start to bother the picnic.
Hmm.
3 guys were invited over by this German guy. And he said, "Oh, here, I want you to meet my friends. He's from Persia, and I told him about you. I want you to meet them." So they come over, and they were 3 guys. One was Chinese, and the 2 others were Middle Eastern. They were all wearing the same type of short leather zip-up jackets. One of them was tan, and the other 2 were black. And they had a certain style, of coming over. And so I got up to greet the first one who was introduced to me. And he was a short fellow with a little mousy face that later turned into a rat. And I said to him, "Hello, my name's Robert." And he shook my hand, and he was wearing a little skull cap, like Muslims do. And I said, "What is your name?" And he said to me, "My name is Nicholas." But the way he said the word Nicholas was unnatural. And I said to myself, "Your name's not Nicholas. Old Nick? No, too young. Young Nick." Those were my intuitive impressions of this fellow. Now, some of the people may know that the term Old Nick means Satan. So I said, and that's the impression I got from this guy, just shaking hands with him. I said, "Old Nick? Nah, too young. Young Nick." Then I was pointed to the other guy, and he was on the other side of the table, a little farther away, so we had to reach over across the table, and in that moment, he had to lean over a table lamp. When he leaned over, I saw that he had cross eyes, and that he had a very big head. This guy had one of the biggest heads I've ever seen on a human being. And I shook his hand, and I said, "I'm Robert. What is your name?" And he said to me, "My name is Mohammed." And I said, "And where are you from?" And he said, "I'm from Persia." And when he said that, my antennas went up, and I got this look on my face, I guess, because I looked at him. First of all, I felt he was lying. Second of all, I said, "Persia? Nobody's called that place Persia since World War II.
Yeah, yeah.
You're talking about Iran." But regardless, you're a Muslim trying to pass yourself off as a German, because he was trying to be German. I don't know how to explain it. But my eyes met his eyes, and when I realized he was lying at me, my eyes traveled down the whole length of his body, down the zipper line, all the way down, and then I looked up at him, and zippered up, like zipper down and zipper up. And when he saw that look, he took my hand and he threw it as if it was dung. But let me tell you what the handshake of Mohammed Atta felt like. It felt like meat without any bones. It felt like I was holding a snake. and he slithered out of my grasp and threw my hand away. And then he sat across the table from me, fuming, absolutely fuming hatred. He was sitting next to two women who had come with this guy, the German guy that I didn't know, who was not part of my circle of the unbroken chain. And they were really hot mamas, you know? What they call in Europe, they call them bombas, you know? Sex pots.
Yeah.
So Mohammed Atta sitting next to them, and this German, all of a sudden he had been very friendly to me for a while, but then when they sat at the table, he started rolling something, and he changed instantly, and he got very arrogant, and he said to me, you Americans, you want to be the policemen of the world. And brother, that got my hackles up, and I said, F you, Jack. Don't give me that crap. We don't want to be policemen of the world. We'd rather be home with our families, our barbecues, and our muscle cars. But you and your people almost destroyed the world twice in the last century, and we're not going to let you do it again. And then I really blew up. Oh, my God. I really blew up. And I said, let me tell you something else. You see this situation in Yugoslavia, in Kosovo, in Croatia? That's going to blow up in your faces. And you know what's going to happen? When it blows up in your faces, you're going to go crying, America, come help us. And we will come help you. We will come help you in Yugoslavia. Because you're just a bunch of pussies and you don't have the spine to stand up for yourselves. And then I really blew up even more. I said, you want to know what's wrong in Yugoslavia? It's Iran. Iran is sending money, arms, and mujahideen to start that trouble in Yugoslavia. And it's going to blow up in your faces. And when I said that, Mohammed Atta on the other side of the table got this look in his face, really crazed look. And he gripped the table and he leaned. And I said to myself, look at that SOB. He looks like he wants to jump right over the table and kill me here right now. And then when that happened, the other guy, Nicholas, saw it. And what he did was really odd. He leaned his face into the lamp so it was illuminated. And he made a face that looked to me like a rat. But then he blew kisses. He went like that. And when Mohammed Atta saw that look, he backed off. And then I started talking again, and Atta went crazy again, and he leaned in again, and he blew kisses at the lamp. Atta saw it, and he leaned back again. And I said to myself, my God, that's the most hate-filled person I've ever seen. And then I looked at him in the context of his seat, his seating. And I said to myself, wow. That guy hates me so much he could kill me right now. But look at that. He hates those women sitting next to him even more than he hates me. This is pure intuition and pure psychism. Guess what happened when Mohammed Atta died? They read his last will and testament, and he said that when he was buried, he did not want any women touching his body. That's how much he hated women. That's how misogynistic Islam really is.
And the irony is, if he had said that in his own home country, I would have think that he would have been beheaded the next day or something to that effect.
Well, the other thing is this. I told you the guy was lying to me. He told me that he was Persian and he was Egyptian. And the other strange, see now here, you know, Donald Trump is the man who released the secrets of 9/11. During the campaign, he complained about the 28 pages of secret FBI memos, secret FBI investigation document that had been written under Robert Mueller's dictatorship at the FBI. And they had been suppressed from 2001, 2002, when the investigations happened, all the way to 2016. They were still secret, top secret. Nobody could see them. And Donald Trump demanded to see them. And when he did that, within 2 weeks, the Congress passed a resolution to declassify them. And when that came out, we found out that Saudi Arabia and the Wahhabi sect was funding Mohammed Atta, Hani Hanjour, Marwan al-Shehi. Those are the three terrorists that I met personally. And they were training in New Jersey at an airport called Essex County Airport, at a place called Caldwell Flying Academy, which is the flying school from which John F. Kennedy Jr. took off on his fatal flight.
Thank you for
Right.
mentioning that, because I was just going to plug that in. If we're talking about the Kennedys and Martin Luther King, might as well talk about his son, because you had the connection to that as well.
That's right. That's right. And remember, John F. Kennedy Jr. was planning to run for senator from New York State. And had he done so, he was a shoo-in. And if he had been elected senator, he would have run for president. And he would have been a shoo-in.
Yes.
Because America has wanted Camelot back. And that's why I say, folks, Donald Trump is the JFK of our times. Let us destroy the deep state and fulfill President Kennedy's dying wish. That's why he was killed. He was planning to destroy the CIA. He announced it a month before his assassination through a leak to the New York Times top columnist, Arthur Kroc. And the leak went like this. A high administration official has revealed that the president is so angry at the CIA that he has promised to break it into 1,000 pieces and scatter it to the four winds.
And unfortunately, it was the CIA where a lot of the agents who were involved in JFK's murder came from. Yeah.
And the cover-up. And the
That's
cover-up.
right. That's right.
The MK Ultra operation was hugely successful. America was put completely under mind control through the all-seeing eye of CBS and the manipulation of the Zapruder film and the doctoring of the autopsy. The Warren Commission autopsy was a fraud. They used the brain of the slain Officer Tippit, who had been slain with one bullet through his head. They used his brain in the autopsy, and these ignorant autopsists of the Warren Commission, who had never performed an autopsy before, had been commandeered by the Army to do this. They saw a brain that had been shot with one bullet through the head. So what conclusion could they have except he was shot by one bullet through the head? Except the skull showed wounds that looked like a wound of entry and a wound of exit simultaneously. This is Dr. Carrico. Dr. Carrico was the doctor who examined President Kennedy in the Parkland Trauma Room 1.
Okay, so it wasn't the one at Bethesda.
No.
Colonel.
So this is the interesting thing. That Dr. Carrico, he was asked when he testified before the Warren Commission, what did it look like? Did it look like a wound of entrance or a wound of exit? And Dr. Carrico said it looked like both, a wound of entry and a wound of exit. Now, I read that sentence and I said to myself, what? What? Are you telling me that the bullet made a U-turn inside the skull, went in and came out? No, what Dr. Carrico was telling us was that the president had been shot by more than one bullet. And that the wounds, the entry wounds, had been crisscrossed.
Another thing with the Zapruder film...
It's too gruesome for most people to take, but... this is what
talking about physics, though, Robert. Just talking about straight physics. Every time I've seen the Zapruder film, I mean, it boggles my mind how people could even buy that a fatal shot from Oswald came from behind where Kennedy was in the school book deposits. But yet, when you look at the Zapruder film, what do you see? Aside from the first shot where he's holding his neck and Jackie Kennedy knows something's wrong with her husband, and then boom, that fatal shot. It has his head bounced backwards, and then the back of his skull essentially explodes. Now, that if the bullet was coming from the back, you would expect that head to bounce forward. it bounced backward because that's what physics imply it would.
Well, you
So
see, there's a huge illusion there. What you have to understand is that in that moment at the grassy knoll, the president was hit by at least 3 shots, triangulation of fire. And what they did was they removed the frames in between the arrival of the shots to make it look as one big jumble as the effect of one shot. Folks, let me just explain it to you in a very simple way. Spread your fingers out, splay your fingers out, and imagine those 5 fingers are 5 shots. And then take a piece of scotch tape and run it from one finger to the other across the top. Okay? That scotch tape would represent the intact Zapruder film. So you would see the first shot was the shot between the shoulder blades in the back, and the president stood up inside the car and fell back down. That was happening at the sign. Mr. Zapruder saw the president's head pop up. Okay? Then he was shot at frame Z295. There was a vapor trail that's visible at that frame. I discovered that in 1992 and exposed it in 1993. Z295 is exactly 18 frames separated from the third shot, which is Z313. That's what you're talking about. They call it frame Z313, where his head explodes. But Z313 is a sequence where 4, 8, 12, 160 frames have been removed at that moment. So imagine this. The intact film is the scotch tape going from thumb, index, middle, ring, pinky. Okay, those are the 5 shots. So what did they do to the Zapruder film? They cut the scotch tape between your thumb and your index finger, and they made that 1 shot, the throat shot. But that was 2 shots. He was shot in the back, then he came out from behind the sign, he was shot in the throat. 2 shots are turned into 1. Okay? Then, the triangulation of fire at the grassy knoll. 160 frames. They cut between the middle finger, and they cut between the ring finger and the pinky, and they joined those 3 into 1 shot. That's how the Zapruder film has been edited in those shots. And there are many more cuts and splices that hide things, like the car hit the sidewalk making the turn, then it slowed down, then it stopped, then it crawled to the sign, then it stopped at the sign. The president was shot. He stood up, he fell back down. The car crawled out with the Secret Service driver looking back, confused, not knowing what to do. It crawled to the grassy knoll. It stopped again. But you don't see those stops. You don't see them at all in the Zapruder film. The fact is, the Zapruder film was shot in slow motion, and the car never went faster than 11.4 miles an hour. So let's make the math easy. Let's say it was going 12 miles an hour, and it was shot in slow motion, so it should appear at 2/3 speed. We should see a car creeping along Elm Street at 8 miles an hour. But what we see is a car that's doing at least 35 miles an hour. And the reason I know this is I found this out when my friend Roy Schaefer and I went down there in 1994 and 1996 and 1998. And I stood up on the pedestal, the abutment where Zapruder was standing, and I put my fingers together, like the director's frame, you put your hands together and make a square. So I was catching the cars as they turned at Elm and Houston, and panning down, and they're doing 20 miles an hour. And I'm kidding. Wow, holy mackerel. These cars are doing 20 miles an hour, and they don't look anything like the speed of the Zapruder film. And just by coincidence, these are the crazy synchronicities that happened to the life of Robert Morningstar. There was a guy named Paul Crute down in Dallas at that time who had bought a limousine identical to the Lincoln Continental limousine that President Kennedy rode in the motorcade. And he would pick up people at the airport, and for a significant sum of money, he'd drive them into Dallas and through Elm Street and down through the kill zone as a tourist attraction. And lo and behold, Paul Crute comes racing down the street in that limousine, and he's doing 35 or 40 miles an hour. And finally, my hands moved fast enough to mimic the Zapruder film, and I said, holy mackerel. Not only did they cut out the stops, they speeded up the film to more than 3 times its normal speed. It is a total fraud. It is pure Mickey Mouse. And the reason that I was able to recognize it and disassemble it is that I went to school at Fordham University for my degree in psychology, and one of the most wonderful things I ever learned, and I specialized in, and I took it up as my school of psychology, it's called Gestalt psychology, which is the psychology of visual perception. And it was a school of psychology that was developed in Germany to determine how a human being forms an idea by collecting visual information, organizing it geometrically, and making sense of this chaotic world that we live in. We organize the world with our eyes. The first thing we do is create a horizontal plane. The second thing we do is create a vertical plane. And within that frame, that window that your mind has created, you start to categorize and aggregate and associate objects and people and the ground itself, the space itself, and you form an idea. You organize reality. You create sense out of chaos. Well, the Germans figured out this psychology in the 1920s, and by the 30s they had it perfected. And the Nazis seized on it. And luckily, some of the best of the Gestalt psychologists escaped Nazi Germany. But here's what the Germans were able to do. They were able, using Gestalt psychology, to draw up a single poster or create a film, a movie, or a photo in such a way that every person who saw that poster would have exactly the same thought at the same time. The one that comes to mind is a poster of Hitler dressed up in armor and holding a lance and crying a black tear, like Alice Cooper. It's a very unusual poster. And anyone who sees this picture would think, Hitler is noble. Hitler is a knight. Hitler is the savior. Hitler is the Messiah. But nobody would say that to anybody. You'd say, hey man, you like that poster? He looks like the Messiah to me. No. But they knew that that's what everybody would think. And that process is what has been used ever since the Kennedy assassination in our country to confuse the public. Look at all the hokum that was pulled on us with the 9/11. The 9/11 airliners crashing into buildings, coming out intact, going in one side, coming out intact with nothing, no damage to the noses. It's unfathomable.
I call that effective propaganda. Seriously,
Of course.
that's
Of
what
course.
it is. If it produces what they want for everyone to perceive the same emotion or idea, then they're effective.
Right.
And it's sad that I guess I don't want to discount human behavior as to not being able to see past that, because when you're surrounded by propaganda, I mean, you'd have to question your sanity if you think that something is differently.
Oh, sure. It's also very depressing, I'm a very happy-go-lucky guy most of the time. And I had never suffered a depression in my whole life. But when I discovered the doctoring of the Zapruder film in 1992, and I realized that I was the only guy in the world that knew this. Not only, many people suspected it, but they couldn't explain it. But when I discovered it and analyzed it, and I realized, my God, I'm the only guy who understands. I'm the only guy who knows this. What am I going to do? I was totally bummed out. And for 2 weeks, nothing mattered to me. Food didn't taste good. There was no taste in food. I didn't have a reason for getting up in the morning. I was totally demoralized. Um, and then 2 weeks into it, I just came to my senses and said, man, this has been laid in your lap. It's your civic obligation to do it no matter what happens. And you're the man who's got to tell the people that this is the film that fooled the world. And I had been prepared for it by a psychic experience that I had had in 1990 when I went to Switzerland. I went to Bern, Switzerland, and I had a wonderful experience there with some wonderful friends. I sat in Einstein's chair. I went to Einstein's apartment. I walked in, and my God, it looked like my apartment in Munich. Long railroad flat, as they call it.
Yes.
And I spent 3 hours there, and I sat in Einstein's chair, and I talked to the curator, who was a complete devotee of Einstein. And then I decided to fly the Matterhorn, because it had been my dream since 1957 to fly in a small airplane and fly around the Matterhorn. So I rented a plane and a mountain guide pilot for the next day. And the night before, I had the most amazing lucid dream, which was actually remote viewing of my life in future. And what it was, in this lucid dream, which is extremely vivid, I found myself in an ice cave. And as I entered the ice cave, I saw a desk there. And I walked up to the desk, and there was a wizened old man there. And I introduced myself, and he said to me, I am the angel of history. Come with me. Let me show you what your people have done to their history. And I followed the angel of history. He stood up. And I'll tell you now, he was a wizened old guy, and he had the face of Carl Jung. And he led me through the ice cave. He had a light. And as we walked through this big, giant ice cave, as we walked through the first part of it, the walls were ice. And I saw people were buried in the ice. And I looked to my left, and there was this beautiful blonde woman in the ice. And I said to myself, my God, that's Marilyn Monroe. And then I walked on, and I looked to the right, and I saw a really handsome-looking movie star. And I tried, like in the movie The Thing, when the thing is still encased in the ice and there's something in there, but they can't make out its features. Well, it was something like that. It was translucent, but not transparent. And I looked at the figure, and I said to myself, wow, he looks like a movie star. He's got red brown hair, and he's got a strong jaw. He looks something like Burt Lancaster or Kirk Douglas. And then we walked on, and we came to this part of the cave where my feet wanted to go to the right, but there was no passage there. I saw it was just a huge boulder, and we were forced to go to the left. And he says, follow me. And as we went to the left path, the cave got narrower and lower and smaller, and we kept going down and getting lower, and we had to crouch and crawl. And then we came to the end of the cave, and the angel pointed his light into the end of the cave, and he said to me, look, this is what your people have done to their history. You have come to the end of humanity. You must go back and tell your people. You must find the right track of history. So we backtracked through the cave, went back to that place where my feet had wanted to go right, but I was forced to go left because there was no way, no thoroughfare. And that time I had only looked at this obstruction, this wall. But this time I walked up to it, and I touched it. And to my amazement, it wasn't rock. It was paper mache and plaster.
So you just broke right through it, in essence.
Not exactly. I looked up, and I looked at the top of it, and it was breaking apart. And there was an aperture there that had I climbed the rock, I would have been able to climb and squeeze through. But I said, no, this is going to take so much. I'm going to need more help. I can't tear this thing down alone by myself. I have to go back. So the angel said, yes, you must go back. And so I go back, and I go back, and I go back. And then we're back, and I'm out of the cave. But now I'm sitting in a theater. And in this theater, I see the film is playing, and the film title says, The Film That Fooled the World. And in this global theater, I'm sitting with my girlfriend as an observer, and I notice that there are armed guards in front of the screen, and they're not looking at the screen, they're looking at the audience. And what they're doing is they're looking at the audience to see anybody who takes his eyes off the screen. And if you took your eyes off the screen, they shot you. I saw two people killed in front of me. And I realized I can't take my eyes off the screen. So I glanced to the right without quite taking my eyes off the screen. And I saw all the millions of people in Europe that were being forced to see the film that fooled the world. Then I looked to my left, and I saw all the people of Asia that were seeing this film, the film that fooled the world. And then I looked to another section of the theater, glancing, and I saw all the people in South America and all the people in Africa. And the whole world was in this theater, being forced to watch the film that fooled the world. And I knew I was in a madhouse and that I was a prisoner and that I had to escape. So how do you escape? If you get up and try to walk out, they'd shoot you, they'd kill you. So I got this idea. And I reached over to my girlfriend's hand and I said, Barbara, come with me. Don't take your eyes off the screen. Stand up. We stood up. The guys looked at us, but we were looking at the screen. So these automatons, they just, oh, he's looking at the screen. I don't have to kill him. So I said, Barbara, walk sideways into the aisle. So we sidled out to the aisle, and we're standing in the aisle. I'm still looking at the screen, and the armed guards with the guns and rifles look at us, but we're looking at the screen. So I said, Barbara, walk backwards out of this theater with me. And we walked backwards up the aisle and backed up through the doors. And we broke out into the doors and like, wow, we're out of the theater. And then we ran, but we went to push the door that would lead us out into the world. The doors were chained. They were chained shut from the outside. So all of us were locked in this global theater where this movie, the film that fooled the world, was running 24/7, 364 days a year, all the time. And anyone who took his eyes off the screen was killed. And I said, we've got to get out of this theater. So we looked for exits, and finally I saw a stairway. We ran up the stairway, and I saw a window, and I threw it open, and I saw it was a 50-foot drop into a raging, torrential Swiss river. And I said, Barbara, this is our only chance. We have to get out of here. Let's jump. And we jumped out of the window, plunged 50 feet into these cold waters, and we hit. And then I looked up, and I saw sunlight, and I was swimming up, pulling her hand with me. And then I broke up into sunshine, and I gasped a breath of air, and I was free. And I woke up, and I said, oh, my God, what the hell is that all about? Well, it was a premonition. It was prescience. It was God speaking to me, getting me ready for a mission that came 2 years later. On November 21st of 1991, I was sick, so I didn't go to work. I took a night off, and I turned on CBS News. And what I got was the coming attraction for the next episode of Hard Copy. And what they were doing was they were running the most beautiful color film of the Zapruder film that you've ever seen. And they said, tonight, we're going to show you the original Zapruder film on hard copy. And I jumped out of my seat. I grabbed the tape, threw it into the VCR, and I recorded that program. And it turned out to be a very special copy of the Zapruder film that had been hijacked. Axel Wexler and the great writer David Lifton, who wrote Best Evidence, which got me started in all of this, they got to see the Zapruder film, and they were handed the Zapruder film to study it for a bunch of hours. Now, Axel Wexler was a top Hollywood cinematographer, and he and a guy named Mo Dalitz and David Lifton got into a room, and they had the film, and they said, let's dupe it. So they duped it. But what they did is they shot a 35 millimeter copy of it, of the original 8 millimeter film. And that's what was shown. And that is how this whole thing started. Now, William Cooper, his manuscript, The Invisible Government, came into my hands in California when my brother and I started talking UFOs. And he said, you've got to read this. He was a security guard at some facility out there. He says, you've got to read this. I'm going to give it to you. So when I came to New York, I read it, and I read that Cooper said the driver shot the president. I said, that's crazy. Come on, give me a break. No, it says the driver pulled out a gun, he shot the president, blah, blah, blah.
Yeah, John Lear actually
Yeah,
was
well,
showing
they're
that film
wrong.
for a
They're wrong.
while.
Let me
Yeah.
tell you. I mean, it's an optical illusion from beginning to end. So I said, oh man, I've got my copy of this approved. I hadn't looked at it since that time I taped it. So I put it in to the VCR. And at that time, I had bought the best Panasonic VCR available. It could do frame by frame, it could do stop frame. It was fantastic. So I started going, and it do slow motion. So I started going through it and looking at the scene where the driver purportedly shot the president, and all of a sudden, all these splice marks start going by. Now, let me tell you something, folks. I'd been making 8 millimeter films since I was 10 years old. And when I was 10 years old, I went down to Lafayette Electronics here in New York City, which was a wholesale electronics place, and I bought a 3-lens Yashica 8 millimeter camera, and I started shooting 8 millimeter film. I hated the camera because it had parallax. It had 3 lenses that you had to switch and a rangefinder. So I would perfectly frame my pictures, my films, but the people's heads were cut off at the top. And I said to my friend, I can't get it. I know I'm framing it. He says, that's parallax, man. The lens is down here and your viewer is up here, so you have to compensate. So then I found out about reflex cameras and a mirrored reflex movie camera. And lo and behold, 1963 comes along, and my father says to me, Robert, what do you want for Christmas? And I said, Pop, I'd love to have a Bell and Howell Optronic Eye movie camera. It's a single lens reflex and it has slow motion, it has animation. Okay. I said, listen, Pop, buy it for me and I'll pay it off. I'll work and I'll pay off for this camera over the year. And he did it. And that's how I got in my hands in 1963. At the age of 15, I had the camera that Zapruder used. The next level up, as a matter of fact, I had the camera that Zapruder used to film the Kennedy assassination. And that's how I always knew that it could do slow motion. And I was able to recognize certain characteristics in the Zapruder film which betrayed to me that it had been shot in slow motion, but it wasn't verified until I read Zapruder's testimony before the Warren Commission when he was being interrogated. And they said to him, what speed did you shoot your film? He said, I shot that at 48 frames per second. And I think it was our inspector said, no, that's not right. The FBI says it was 18 frames per second. He said, no, I shot it at 48. And no, the FBI says 18.3 frames per second. He said, no, I shot it at 48. And then they realized, oh my God, we better shut up. What he's telling us is he shot the movie in slow motion. Then they go on and talk to him again about what he saw. And he says, and then the car came behind the sign and I saw the president's head pop up. And he said, no. You couldn't have seen that because the president was hidden by the sign. And he said, no. When the car came behind the sign, I saw the president's red hair, red hair pop up behind the sign and then fall back down. And they freaked out because what he was telling them was that the film had been cut and that the car had stopped. So they just deflected again to another topic, another subject, and let that statement lie on the cutting room floor until Robert Morningstar read it in 1993, 94. So that's how deeply involved I am in it, folks. So don't believe the Zapruder film. It is a total fraud from beginning to end.
I have to say this for everybody out there. Robert Morningstar is the main person to speak to about JFK. He knows more facts than you can ever even think that there's a possibility of existing. For instance, one thing, Robert, that you did that was great is you were able to splice the image of JFK on one side and Officer Tidbit on the other. And when you look at them side by side, where one hemisphere is John F. Kennedy, the other hemisphere is Officer Tidbit, they look almost identical. What gave you that impression that Tidbit was being used?
Dr. J, I'm going to call this program The Confessions of Robert Morningstar, because I'm going to reveal to you how this was revealed to me. This is a very profound, deep central spiritual experience of my life. This is the reason why I was born. I mentioned the attempted assassination of Ronald Reagan just a few minutes ago.
Yes.
On that day, I was at Oberlin College teaching in the East Asian Studies Department as a visiting professor, teaching Tai Chi and Chinese history. And on that day, Reagan was shot. All of us were really, really, shocked.
Bummed too.
Bummed.
Yeah.
Right.
Worried.
Even though I was not a particular admirer of Ronald Reagan as a president then, though I'd loved Ronald Reagan since the first time I saw him as the Gipper and in all his cowboy movies, But he was just an actor to me, and he'd become president. No big deal, But anyway, he's a human being. He was the president. And as the poet said, every man's death diminishes me, for I am involved in mankind. So ask not for whom the bell tolls, it tolls for thee. So that night, I happened to be reading a book called Perilander by C.S. Lewis. And as I walked in my dormitory room at Spanish House at Oberlin College, getting ready for bed about 10:30, 10:45 that night, I was thinking about the events of the day, and I said to myself, there's something really evil on this planet walking around and killing good men. And it's always the same story. Lone assassin, crazed person, lone nut. And that's the day that when I saw Hinckley's picture, I said, my God, is this guy a clone of Mark David Chapman who killed John Lennon just a few months ago? Where are they getting these guys? So that was my thought. And I lay myself in bed. I'm sleeping naked. I pull up the sheets. And I'm in this room that's illuminated by a street lamp. It was on the second floor. And at Oberlin, they had high street lamps for the traffic. And the light is coming in the window. And I'm seeing the entire room illuminated by neon light. And as I'm contemplating this thought, there's something evil on this planet, killing good men. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw something white attract my attention. And I looked, and I saw a white figure come right through the wall. And I was utterly shocked. And this figure was dressed in white from head to foot. He had a white robe on and a white cincture. He had a white headdress like a pharaoh. And he had a white covering over his face. And he walked excruciatingly slowly across the room. There was a desk by the wall. There was another single bed. There was a space between the beds. There was my bed. And there was a desk on my right. And he walked like I do Tai Chi. And I have the reputation of doing the slowest Tai Chi form you can imagine, because I learned it from a grandmaster. So he's walking toward me, and these were my impression. First impression, my God, this is the most powerful person that's ever walked the earth. And then my body started shaking, and my body started trembling. And he's walking steadily, gliding, oozing like a fog across the floor. And my body starts shaking even more. And it starts saying, oh, he knows you're scared, but he doesn't want to scare you. That's why he's approaching you with a Tai Chi walk. He knows you know Tai Chi. And as my breathing goes, and my heart starts pounding. And I'm saying, oh my God, how can I bear this? He doesn't want to scare me, but I'm going into terror, absolute terror.
I would too. I don't think anyone out there wouldn't be terrified.
And then I
of
see he's back. I had other ghost experiences. I tell you, I'm devoted to Tai Chi because when my Tai Chi grandmaster died, before I got word, he came to visit me here in New York, and he approached me. I got scared then too. I mean, it's not easy, folks. You're alone in your room, and there's the apparition, and it's real, it's solid, it's walking toward you. What do? Well, most of us resort to fright or flight, right? But because you're paralyzed, you can't fly. I would have. So I'm frightened. I'm paralyzed with fright. So when this happened, the first one, when the master came, I clenched my fist to defend myself. Who is this intruder? And the voice said to me, don't be afraid, Robert. Nothing can harm you. And then I felt love from that person and that being, and such care and such love and compassion for me that I was overwhelmed. I thought I was experiencing Christ. And he came and he touched me and he left. And that changed my life forever. And an hour later, I got word that my Tai Chi master had died. And I said, if he loved me that much to come and see me and do this, then this is my life for the rest of my life, Tai Chi. So this ghost is coming and it's terrifying me. Every cell in my body was screaming. I mean, I could screech right now and scare the hell out of all of you. So he's coming, and so I seized back on what my Tai Chi master had said. Don't be afraid, Robert. Nothing can harm you. And so I seized on that, and my mind and my soul, my spirit, started saying to this person, I love you, but I don't want to see your face. It was covered by a shroud. I love you, but I don't want to see your face. I love you, but I don't want to see your face. And I just kept saying that over and over and over, holding on to love while the rest of my body went into absolute terror and panic. Such terror as no human being can comprehend unless you can hear a scream coming from every cell and every hair in your body. And he comes across the foot of my bed. And I said to myself, oh my God, this is death. Because my heart's going like...
Pounding, yeah.
And I look down and I feel my chest heaving. And I said, my God, it feels like my chest is lined with concrete. Because if it wasn't there, my heart would explode or run out of the room. And then he's coming. And I said, my God, this is death. This is why they find people dead in their sleep in the morning. And they said, this poor guy had a heart attack. So he turns the foot of my bed. And now he's coming right at me, looming over me. And I said to myself, my God, this is antimatter. If we touch, poof, it's gone. Annihilation. And I keep saying, I love you, but I don't want to see your face. And now he's right next to me, standing next to my right side, right alongside my liver. And I said to him, listen, I love you, but I don't want to see your face. I'm really strong, but please, if you lift that veil, I think I'll die. Please don't lift the veil. So what he did is he did not lift the veil, but he leaned over and he pressed it against himself. And John, audience, put your hand 3 inches from your nose. Put your hand 3 inches from your nose. And that's how close he came to me. And he said to me, behold my face. Remember me. And I said to him, who are you? I know you, but I haven't seen you in so long. And then he said again, look at my face. Behold my face. Remember me. And again I said, who could you be? I know you. And these were my words to myself. Could you be the Christ? Could you be my soul? Could you be the soul of a Sufi master? Who are you? I know you, but I haven't seen you in so long. And then he said, we don't want you speaking to people of what you know. And I was taken aback. I said, we? Where are you coming from? And then he said, Lucifer has taken over Islam and is going to use it as his vehicle to destroy mankind. And I said, I understand. And he nodded ever so slightly. And then he stood up. And then he walked out. He walked away and left me a bag of quivering jelly, crying, squirming, trembling, pitying. I pitied my body. My mind was strong, my spirit was strong, my soul was strong. My body was utterly craven, shaking like a leaf. And he walked out, and the duration was exactly as long as it took to come in. And I saw him walk straight out and go through the wall and into the wall and disappear. And I jumped out of bed, and all I could say was, oh my God, oh my God, oh my God. Trembling, crying, sweating. And it took 13 years for me to remember that face because the message that he gave me was so horrible. The warning about Lucifer taking over Islam to destroy mankind. That I devoted myself to study Islam to find out how that had happened. And 14 years later, I found myself at Stonehenge at midnight. And the Druid Order was there. And when they donned their robes, I recognized that it was not a Sufi, it was not a pharaoh, it was a Druid. And the face came back to me. And the face was the face that's in that picture. And the reason I did not recognize who he was that the expression was so alien to his being, to his nature, that I didn't recognize John F. Kennedy.
That's who came to you.
And the expression on the face was this. The expression on the face was the same expression that was on the only photograph of Officer Tippit available for 30 years. And it was that expression that lured me, drew me, my curiosity. It was striking chords in my subconscious. And within a year, I recognized that not only was Officer Tippit's brain used for the autopsy, but it was Officer Tippit's body and pictures of Officer Tippit dressed up, shaved, made up to look like President Kennedy.
And Robert,
no one has yet seen a real photograph of President Kennedy in the morgue because it just would be too ghastly.
I'm glad you were able to identify that before our time is up, but I didn't want to interrupt the story because it's so fascinating. And next time we definitely have to, I want to be able to show that picture. But real quick, I do want to be able to plug in your show, the show you have coming up Sunday, and everything else before we are off air real quick.
Sure. Well, the first thing I'd like to plug is the documentary that I did last year on November 22nd. I released on YouTube a film that's called Warning, The Ultimate Secrets of the JFK Assassination. And that's the key words. Type in Warning, The Ultimate Secret of the JFK Assassination. It'll pop up number one. Secondly, I would like to say, read UFOdigest.com and read about the last acts of Robert F. Kennedy. That's part one. Part two will come soon. The criminal always returns to the scene of the crime. Number three, I would like to say that on Sunday at 3 o'clock Eastern, 12 noon Pacific, Mountain people and Central people are really smart. You can extrapolate. I will have as my guest Thomas R. Dickens, the producer of Aliens, Zone X, one of the best exposés of the alien intrusion into our lives that I have ever seen. It's an independent production that I first saw in 2010 as Thomas was working on it. It was unfinished. Then he finished it. It's a wonderful film. Not wonderful in the sense of ha-ha, great. It is the real McCoy. And for that, Thomas has been threatened. Thomas has been blacklisted in Hollywood. And he's been harassed and gang-stalked. And Thomas is going to talk about it. So we're going to discuss Aliens X Zone on Sunday on Revolution Radio, revolution.radio, at 3 p.m. Eastern to 5 o'clock with my co-host Scott Teeters and my guest Thomas R. Dickens. And we'll take it up from there.
And everybody, I implore you to make sure you check out that JFK/Officer Tidbit video or picture that Robert Morningstar was able to put together. And just like I said from the beginning of this show, we will never have enough time to get all the information that Robert has. No two shows are alike, and I'm glad we had the climax of the visitation. That is definitely something we're going to pick up. Unfortunately, we did come to the end of the show. So with that being said, everybody, other than that, this is Dr. J, and we are officially signing out.